Morning guys, it's a cold frosty morning and I'm doing a kit video again. I want to talk about the 5 most important things we need to consider when it comes to buying a camera body for wildlife photography. Now for those of you that aren't into photography, there will be a few pictures scattered throughout this video, so hopefully you might find those interesting. If not, then I totally get it if you don't want to watch this vlog. But as photographers, when it comes to wildlife photography, the camera body we buy is really important. And as I say, this is only my personal opinions, obviously, but these are the top 5 things I think we need to think about when we're buying a camera body for wildlife photography. Now, it won't be a surprise for me to be saying that I think the first one and the most important one is autofocus. We need a fast, accurate autofocus system. Now, we need the autofocus to work in low light conditions. We need it to lock on quickly onto the animal we're photographing, because we're doing fast moving action sometimes. Now if you're only photographing a bird on a stick, then pretty much any autofocus system on any modern camera is going to be fine. If we're doing more challenging subjects like these common turns that are coming up, we need an autofocus system that can keep up with their movement, because they're twisting and turning all the time, and they're changing position. So I would say autofocus is the most important. Now these days there's lots of different options. A lot of cameras have got animal eye detect and bird eye detect, and I think that's a real option to look for. My Nikon hasn't got that at the moment, but as soon as Nikon bring a reasonable price body out with bird eye detect, I will definitely get that. Or I am thinking of maybe changing camera manufacturers because of that, but that's a different video. I've talked about that already. So autofocus is the most important thing. If you can get autofocus with animal eye detect, I would say that's a really good option. And if I was buying a camera body now and coming into photography from scratch, that'll be my #1 consideration. And then accuracy and speed is obviously really important as well. One other thing I think I ought to mention about the autofocus system is not really about the autofocus system, more about the camera body, but it's a really good option if you can use back button focusing, and that's where you decouple the autofocus system from the shutter release. And for action photography, wildlife photography, it's a really good option to have. So not all camera bodies can give you that ability, but if you're picking a camera body for wildlife photography, I think the ability to use back button focusing is a really good thing, so that's something else to look out for. The next thing I want to talk about is high ISO performance, and again that's really vital for wildlife photography, because often we're out early in the morning or late in the afternoon stroke evening, so it means the light levels are low. So we need a camera body that can perform really well in low light conditions, and that means using a high ISO. So what we want is a camera body that doesn't create too much noise when we shoot with high ISO numbers. Now there are lots of software packages available to reduce the noise, but it's still better if you've got a camera body that's got a good high ISO performance. And we've basically got the choice of a full frame camera body, an APS-C crop censored body, or a 4/3 camera body. And essentially the bigger the sensor, the better that camera is going to be at noise performance, or high ISO noise performance. So micro 4/3 are really good now, and they're getting better and better cameras at high ISO performance. But the fact of the matter is, a full frame camera sensor will give you a better noise performance than a micro 4/3, and a APS-C sensor is sort of in the middle. It will give you a better performance generally than a 4/3 system, but it won't be as good as a full frame system. Now there are pluses and minuses. A 4/3 system is much smaller, much more portable, and generally cheaper to buy. So if you're starting out in wildlife photography, it might be a bad idea. APS-C is sort of a compromise between the two really, and then full frame will give you optimum quality, but it's the most expensive, it's the bigger camera bodies, and the lenses are generally bigger. So I would say it depends on your personal circumstances, and it's a compromise between cost, portability, or absolute top quality. I use full frame at the moment, but I wouldn't rule out. I've used APS-C cameras, and I've still got an APS-C crop sensor body, Nikon D500, and I have been thinking about a 4/3. So it's, you know, just be aware that the bigger the sensor, the better the high ISO noise performance will be. And if you look at this picture of a nuthatch coming up, this was taken at ISO, excuse me, this was taken at ISO 4000, which is quite a high ISO number, and the noise control on this is really good. And this is on my Nikon Z6 II mirrorless camera body. So again, personal choice. It's a question of quality versus cost and portability. But even the 4/3 system, as I say, is really good for noise control, so certainly don't rule it out. The third thing I want to talk about is image quality, and I think it's really hard to find a camera that doesn't produce really good image quality. But when it comes to wildlife photography, the higher the megapixel count on the camera, the more ability we've got to crop. So it means if you've got a camera that's got 30, 40, 50 million pixels, you've got a greater cropping ability than if you've got a camera that's got 20 million pixels. Now if you look at this picture of a swallow, this is quite heavily cropped actually, and I took this on a 36 million pixel camera. So that means I've got the ability to sort of crop half the frame and essentially still have 18 million pixels left. Whereas if I was to shoot this on my Nikon D500, that's only a 20 million pixel camera. So if I crop half of that frame, I'm down to 10 million pixels, which by the way would be enough actually. So the more megapixels you've got, the better the ability it is you have to crop that image if that wildlife is further away than you'd like it to be. The only downside though is the higher the megapixel count on the sensor, the more digital noise you're going to get. And I was out a couple of days ago, and I was doing some photography with another guy, and he had a higher megapixel Nikon than I did have. He had the Z7 II and I've got the Z6 II, and the noise on the Z7 II was more noticeable than on the Z6 II. Now, is that a problem? Not the end of the world, because it's still very good. So, you know, it's horses for courses. Sometimes that higher megapixel count will be better because he can crop more. But the fact of the matter is, the higher the megapixels, generally the more digital noise you get. But the higher the megapixel count, the more ability you've got to crop that image if your wildlife is quite distant. So again, it's a compromise. You have to look at your own situation and choose, you know, what is the most important, high megapixel count or slightly better high ISO performance. So number 4 on the list is frames per second. So in other words, how many frames per second can our camera shoot in a continuous burst? So with my Nikon Z6 II, I can do 14 frames a second. A lot of the Canons can do 20 frames a second. Some cameras can do 30 frames per second, and the Olympus OM1 I think can do 50 frames per second. Now, do we need 50 frames per second? Probably not, but when you've got really fast moving action and you've got wings flapping and the wings might be going in front of the bird's face and then coming down again, or there might be a slight movement, having a high frame rate is really important. So you could argue the more frames per second you've got, the better. The only thing it does mean, if you're on 50 frames per second, you've got a lot of pictures to wade through post-production when you get home. But generally, higher the frame rate per second, the better it's going to be for action photography, particularly wildlife photography. And the second thing that's really important is the buffer. So how many pictures at that sort of high burst rate can the camera record before the internal buffer, the internal memory fills up and the camera needs to have a rest, so it basically stops taking pictures in order to write them to the memory card. Bigger the buffer, the better it is, because you can shoot more pictures. So what you don't want to do is to hit that shutter button, go bang, 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 keep taking pictures, and then just when a really special bit of action happens, the camera needs to take a rest. So the higher the buffer, the better it is. Now, one thing that does help is having a fast memory card as well. So it's not part of the actual camera, obviously, but the faster the transfer rate of data from the camera to the memory card. So if you've got a fast memory card, it means that's going to write that data much more quickly and it keeps you shooting for longer. So that's important as well. And then last but not least, when you're photographing, say, things like woodland birds, and you want to get a shot of them taking off, they go really quickly. And we're just not quick enough on a lot of occasions to get that action. So what I used to do, and what I still do to a certain extent, is just when they land, hold the shutter button down and just keep taking pictures and then hope they take off while I'm still shooting. and that's an option. But with some camera bodies, and this is again a really important thing to consider, you've got something called Pro Capture, or a version of Pro Capture. Pro Capture is the Olympus. Other cameras are starting to bring it into some of their camera bodies. And what it basically does is it takes a series of pictures when you just activate the autofocus. And then once it hits a certain number, it starts to delete the very first picture. So you've got a rolling number of pictures being taken, and then when you hit the shutter button, you're starting to take pictures of that piece of action, but you've already got maybe 50 pictures before that. So when you wanted to get that little bit of action and you weren't quick enough to hit the shutter button, the camera's already recorded 50 pictures previous to when you've hit the shutter button. So Pro Capture, or a version of Pro Capture, is another really useful feature for a camera body for wildlife photography. So I would definitely look at getting a camera body that's got that option. Now if you look at these pictures, or this series of pictures of the jays, this was shot using a frame rate of 10 frames per second, which is these days not particularly fast, but it's fast enough. Fact of the matter is 10, 20, 30 frames per second is going to be great. But what it's enabled me to do is to take this shot of this jay taking off, because I hit the shutter button. This was taken on my Nikon D500 a while ago. It's got a really good buffer, so it means I can keep shooting for a long time. And I just held the shutter button down, the jay took off, and I got the picture of it taking off. If I'd have waited for it to move, I would have probably been too late. So that's where the fast frame rate, although it's not super fast by today's standards, but the big buffer plays an important role in getting this picture. The last thing I want to talk about when it comes to a camera body for wildlife photography is the general design of it, the build quality, and the features such as weatherproofing. But before I do that, if you're enjoying this video, if you can give it a thumbs up, a like, that would be brilliant. That always helps my channel. If you haven't already subscribed, if you can consider subscribing, that would be great. And if you've got any thoughts of your own on camera bodies for wildlife photography, or wildlife photography in general, just drop them in the comment section below. But yes, so the thing is, there are certain attributes or certain qualities you get with camera bodies that can keep you out taking photographs longer. So one of those will be weatherproofing. If you're shooting in extreme conditions, out in the rain, the snow, the wind, then having a fully weather sealed camera body is a great thing, along with a fully weather sealed lens, of course. But this is about camera bodies today, so that would be one thing to think about. The second thing, I think, and generally every camera body's got this, either in the lens or in the body or both, is good image stabilisation. And image stabilisation these days is fantastic. Now if you look at the picture, this picture of a seal I took on a Norfolk beach, there was a rain shower, so it wasn't super heavy rain, but I wanted to keep shooting. So the weather sealing on my camera is a really good thing to have. I did have a rain cover on as well, mind you. The other thing I wanted to do is I wanted to get a shot at a slow shutter speed, because I wanted to get, if you notice, you can see the rain is forming streaks, and in order to get this, I was hand holding the camera, wasn't on a tripod, and I shot at 125th of a second, which is generally quite slow for wildlife photography, and to avoid camera shake. And camera shake creates a blurred image because you're moving the camera about using too slow a shutter speed. Even if you hold it steady, it's easy to get camera shake on a slow shutter speed. So the image stabilisation steadied the picture, the image, and I was able to shoot this picture at a slow shutter speed to get that movement of the water, the rain dropping down, and create a picture that maybe I wouldn't have been able to take a few years ago. So image stabilisation is important. Weatherproofing is important, and the general feel of the camera. You know, how does it feel in your hand? Do all the buttons feel right? And I think you can't put too high a price on that. Actually, the camera's got to feel good in your hands, and again, that's a really personal choice. And before you buy a camera body, I'd really suggest going out and getting one in your hands, feeling it. Does it fit your hands well? Are you comfortable with this camera body? So that's probably about it now. The only last thing I wanted to mention, and this has got nothing to do with the actual camera body side of things for wildlife photography, but also I think it's a good idea to look at the lens lineup a certain camera manufacturer has. Does it have a lot of good long lenses for that you can use for wildlife photography? Are there lenses from third-party manufacturers that might be a bit cheaper, because long lenses are super expensive. And if you've only got a very limited selection of long super fast telephoto lenses that are really expensive, then that might not be the option to go, because it's about budget, isn't it? Whereas if another manufacturer has got the big super fast telephoto lenses, but it's got some reasonably priced zoom lenses in its own lineup, and then another camera manufacturer, an independent manufacturer, is also making, say, long super zooms, then you've got a much greater variety of lenses to choose from. And you might want to start with a reasonably priced lens and see if, you know, how interested you are in wildlife photography, and then buy a more expensive one later on. That's why, you know, that's the way most of us start off. So lens lineup is also, I think, quite an important consideration when it comes to buying a camera body for wildlife photography. So I hope this video has been useful, guys. I hope you found it interesting. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll say bye for now, and I'll see you hopefully on my next video. So yeah, bye for now, guys.